The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
On this week's show, we welcome Marc Levy, the political bureau chief for politics for Pennsylvania for the Associated Press. Marc is a native of Colorado and graduated from Boston University with a journalism degree, and then went to work for the Associated Press. At AP, he would go on to become editor and publisher, assigned to cover Pennsylvania politics. In 2008, the Politicker PA named Marc one of those most powerful political reporters in Pennsylvania. His work has been featured in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Houston Chronicle, Yahoo Entertainment, and Bloomberg Business Week. In his time at AP, Marc has covered the administrations of 3 governors, as well as 5 campaigns for the United States Senate. He is also an international reporter for the AP, having covered the Civil War in Cambodia. On today's show, we will be discussing the Republican landslide in Pennsylvania and the effect that will have on state government, including the canary in the coal mine, which is that the Pennsylvania House of Representatives somehow remain Democrat despite all the red paint over the Pennsylvania map. We will also discuss what the outcome means for Governor Josh Shapiro and his future ambition to run for President of the United States in 2028. Finally, please stay tuned for my post-mortem on why the Democrats lost this election, which will immediately air following the show.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial, the area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Marc, welcome to the Volpe Report.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you've been a regular guest going back a bunch of years. I know you were, this is your first time solo, so I have the pleasure of your company all by yourself. What's your take, and you have as long as you want, starting with the presidential race, the U.S. Senate race, the Republicans effectively sweeping most of Pennsylvania. They swept all the row offices in a major way. They flipped congressional seats. In my media market, 2 heavyweights went, Susan Wild and House Appropriations Chairman Matt Cartwright, to neophytes, to young, never-before candidates. So with that having been said as backdrop, what was your take on what happened in Pennsylvania?
So it all really just does flow from the top, the election of Donald Trump, and that's where most people are casting their votes, right? Everything down ballot, fewer people are voting in those races. And the best test of the mood of the electorate is at the top level, at the presidential level, and that's where Donald Trump won by 2 percentage points. When you look at the Senate race, we had strategists from both sides saying that Trump was running about 2 percentage points ahead of David McCormick, who was the Republican nominee for Senate. In other words, Bob Casey, the Democratic incumbent, was running about 2 percentage points ahead of Kamala Harris. And if Trump got enough votes that he could pull David McCormick across the finish line, that was the assessment of both sides, essentially. And he did. He got enough votes to pull David McCormick across the finish line right now. Right, barely. The votes are still being counted. There's a lot of provisionals that counties are still sorting through. There's going to be a state-mandated recount,
Correct.
Because it is within the margin.
Right.
But essentially, Donald Trump got enough votes to help bring David McCormick across the finish line. And below that, you saw even fewer votes for the row offices: treasurer, auditor general, and attorney general. What we know is that there were 2 incumbents running for auditor general and treasurer. Republicans won both those offices. And for attorney general, it was an open office. Josh Shapiro won governor in 22, so his appointee was finishing out his term. So it was an open office. The Republican in that race had a lot of help in spending and outspending the Democrat. Yep. His spending was about 2-1 over the Democrat, and you saw that play out. That Dave Sunday had a pretty convincing win. The really interesting thing about it is that Republicans have never won all three row offices since the Attorney General's office became an elected position in 1980.
Wow.
Republicans have never held all three at one time.
Thank
So
you
this
for
is a
the
first.
information, by the way. It's rare I get on politics. I find something about that I like at that level I didn't know. So thank you, Mark. I learned something. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. Democrats have done much better in those races in the past decade and a half. And then we see at the state Senate level, Republicans will maintain their 28 to 22 majority in that chamber. They lost one seat in the Harrisburg area, which was expected. That seat was redrawn to take out a gerrymander that Republicans had put in 2012 to try to win the seat. Democrats put a priority on redrawing that seat back to its boundaries that it had been historically, and they won it back. But Republicans also pulled off a pretty impressive victory by picking up a Philadelphia seat, a northeastern Philadelphia seat. And so they've been able to keep their 28-22 margin in that chamber. In the state House, incredibly, it is still a one-seat Democratic majority. It was a one-seat Democratic majority in the last session. And out of 203 seats on the ballot, none of them changed hands. They all went back to their original owners. It's pretty impressive. The one seat that had been in question was in Johnstown, where there's a Democrat, Frank Burns, who often votes with Republicans on top level legislation on high profile or controversial legislation. And he was able to maintain that seat despite it otherwise being a Republican performing area.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you and I had talked about off camera with this red wave that washed across the whole country, basically, and of course in Pennsylvania as well, as we documented and you broke down very nicely, all starting with the presidential and on down. You know, the politician in me, having watched this a long time, it's hard for me to conceive, and I like your what I consider expert opinion. How did the Republicans not take the House when they only had to pick up one seat? Like, based on what happened, we lost a 6-term House Appropriations Chairman for Congress. We lost, I think, a 6 or 7 term right next door in Susan Wild. They were not races that people thought could flip. I didn't think so, to be honest with you. So they flipped them. How do they not flip one seat somewhere in this gigantic Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, somewhere that would have allowed them to have the majority in the House? Your opinion, Mark.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up those 2 congressional seats. I neglected to mention that Republicans also picked up 2 congressional seats in Pennsylvania, which is going to go a long way towards helping them maintain the majority in the U.S. House for the first 2 years of Donald Trump's second term.
That's been called, by the way, officially. They have kept the House.
Right. And those 2 seats in Pennsylvania were super helpful to Republicans. That was Matt Cartwright, a 6-term Democratic incumbent in the Scranton and Wilkes-Barre area who lost, and Susan Wild, a 3-term incumbent, Democratic incumbent from the Allentown area who lost. Right. And so, the difference between the federal offices and the state offices is that every voter survey that I've seen and that AP did shows that inflation was a really, really powerful motivator for swing voters. And with Donald Trump on the ballot, he's very powerful, getting people to come out and vote and to come out and vote for him. And those 2 forces combined really helped Republicans at the federal level, particularly U.S. Senate congressional races, not to mention himself. When you're talking about the state level, you have these very, very small districts, right, for House. There's 203 seats. That carves up Pennsylvania to 203 districts. And people are voting on more local issues. They're also voting for someone who they're familiar with, who's been on the ballot before. And that person is being challenged by an incumbent who they may not know much about. These typically are low information races with local issues. And so it's a different dynamic, the way people vote for, say, a state House race than they do for, say, president. And that will help explain to some degree why there might be some ticket splitting why there might be people who vote at the top of the ticket for president and maybe U.S. Senate, but they're not voting in their state house race because they don't know who's running or they're not familiar with those candidates. And so the Trump effect at the top of the ticket may not necessarily flow all the way down to the bottom of the ticket for Republicans.
Maybe the Democrats did a better job of drawing the districts. And what I mean by that is one of the not talked about much, because it's not fancy or controversial, was the historic, in I believe 2016 or 15, but almost 10 years ago, the historic sweep of 3 Supreme Court justice races in Pennsylvania. David Wecht, Kevin Doherty, and I can't remember the third, but there were 3 of them. And that had never happened. It had been a bastion of Republican, people voted Republican for judge like for 50 years before that. So one of my theories is they did a lot better job of drawing districts that made them safer and made them savable. I think that probably, along with some of the factors you talked about, might have had something to do with it. What's your thought on that possibility?
Look, you can argue the districts from either side. Republicans, when they were drawn, argued that these were gerrymandered. Democrats said that these districts were drawn very down the middle and were getting rid of a couple decades of Republican gerrymanders that helped deliver Republican seats. Right. So, look, you can argue it either way. You can look at how the seats are drawn for yourself. But the bottom line is that Pennsylvania is a very politically divided state. There's a reason why it is the premier battleground state in presidential elections. The other thing is that when you look back over the past couple of decades, Democrats have won a lot more statewide races than Republicans have.
Sure.
The race you pointed to, the Supreme Court race where Democrats won 3 of 3 seats on the ballot for state Supreme Court in 2015 was obviously a watershed for Democrats.
Historic.
In terms of, I mean, it was a big stepping stone for Democrats to capture more statewide court seats, whereas Republicans had really done much better in that realm. But when you look at the whole of statewide elections, including court seats, races for president, U.S. Senate, governor over the past couple decades, Democrats have won many more of those than Republicans have. Now, this 2024 election with Republicans sweeping all statewide races on the ballot, all 5, will help them narrow that gap. But there still is a significant advantage for Democrats over that period, which tells you that this is more of a Democratic performing state than Republicans in a neutral political year, or that Democrats have put up better candidates or done a better job of getting people to polls, whatever you want to point to. But it's not a surprise necessarily that Democrats would control a chamber of the legislature, given what we know about the political makeup of Pennsylvania.
What was there before the election is there after the election. You have a Democratic House. I'm assuming Joanna McClinton will stay the Speaker. She's been on the show a few times. But it's 1 vote, which is precarious. And you already mentioned the legislator from Johnstown sometimes switches. The Senate performs strongly for Republicans. It's a pretty strong Republican Senate. And we still have Josh Shapiro. Although, and this is going to be the segue into Josh Shapiro, he's already looking towards his reelection in 2 years, which I'm sure he's looking for beyond that to make a statement reelection, to have a massive victory, which will give him the impetus to run, which I believe he is running for president of the United States in 2028. So what do you see from Josh? We had some discussion off camera. First, how do you think, and what direction on some key issues, how will he present himself to the voters of Pennsylvania in 2 years so that will become, his bio heading into the presidential primaries in 2028?
He has consistently talked about the need for bipartisanship and the need to bring Democrats and Republicans together to agree on getting things done. These were the types of words he was speaking in November 2022 after he won the election, and he's saying these kinds of things today. The same thematic idea that you're only going to get things done if you bring people from both sides together. That's been his message. It is his message. He won the 2022 election convincingly. I think it was around 14 or 15 percentage points against a relatively weak opponent. But Josh Shapiro was also seen as a very strong candidate for Democrats, a fundraiser like none other in the history of Pennsylvania. And he has governed as someone who is transactional, willing to do deals with Republicans to get Democratic priorities done. We've seen that happen, and he will go into this new legislative session with one house controlled by Democrats, one house controlled by Republicans. And he will talk about himself as the only governor in the United States, at least he did these past couple of years, as the only governor in the United States with a divided legislature. Now, if you ask some people in the legislature, they would say that that actually benefits him because he's not forced to veto Republican priorities that he disagrees with or have to somehow saw down or sand down the rough edges of Democratic priorities that he disagrees with should there have been a Democratic controlled legislature. The friction point is a lot earlier. The Democratic House blocks Republican priorities from the Senate that they disagree with, and vice versa, so that Josh Shapiro isn't forced to be the bad cop in the room by vetoing a lot of Republican legislation. This will be his message. It has been his message of bipartisanship, and quite likely he will carry that into his reelection campaign, which, given the 2-year cycle, essentially is going to begin in January.
Have you heard about any Republicans that would be looking to take him on? I've heard of one myself right off the top. I've heard Stacey Garrity has talked to some people about it. And beside her, have you heard about anybody else?
I haven't heard about anybody else. I would just say for her, you're right. She landed a lot of votes in this past election. She campaigned hard in 2022 for Republican candidates. So she has put herself in front of a lot of Republican audiences around the state. Her name is probably very well known at this point to the Republican base, but perhaps not very well known to the broader electorate since she hasn't run in a high profile, high voter knowledge race with a lot of spending. Her races have played out in the shadow of the presidential election in 2020 and 2024. But yeah, she is the name that will be on the tip of Republican tongues to see whether she does want to challenge Josh Shapiro. For the 2 years where she was treasurer and Josh Shapiro was governor, they did work very well together. Their staffs were able to work well together, and you didn't see really any friction between them on a very professional level. And we also know that Josh Shapiro did not endorse the Democrat challenging Stacey Garrity for re-election. So, that situation also may have engendered some friendliness between them. Whether she'll run is anyone's guess. But you're right that her name will be prominent as Republicans search for a challenger to Josh Shapiro.
And we'll get you out of here on this, Mark. So always saving the best for last. And I understand this is utter speculation, but that's what politics is, right? People speculate. Is Josh Shapiro going to run for president? Do you think he will, if he wins, as he will be the odds-on favorite to win overwhelmingly re-election to governor, that he will pivot and then be a candidate for governor, for president of the United States in 2028? Just personal opinion.
Yeah, look, I have no idea. I could guess, but I'd probably be wrong. But, what we know is that Josh Shapiro is viewed as a rising star in the Democratic Party. He was on the short list of candidates interviewed by Kamala Harris to be her running mate. He didn't make it, as we know. The governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, was her choice to be her running mate. But he is on a short list of rising stars in the Democratic Party. He will be the favorite to win re-election for governor in this state after having such a successful run in 2022. And what happens after that is anyone's guess. There will be a lot of people who want that nomination. For all we know, Kamala Harris could run again. U.S. senators tend to see themselves as presidential material, and there's a number of governors around the United States who are Democrats who also will have, presumably, their eyes on the White House.
One of the, I guess, the Democratic critiques of themselves, hindsight being 2020, on what happened to this election was that they didn't have a primary, even if it was a short one, that they didn't have a primary. They were kind of cheated out of putting up their best candidate. Again, hindsight's 2020, but the overwhelming consensus that she wasn't the best candidate, for a number of reasons, either her own failed campaign in 2019, meaning Kamala Harris, or the fact that she was going to inherit all of Joe Biden's baggage, which were anchors, obviously, on her in her run for president. So, yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think it's going to be fun to watch. You're going to need two platforms on the debate stages for all the candidates that I expect will be running on the Democratic side.
And it could be that the debate within the Democratic Party that's playing out now, whether the party needed to be more moderate or needed to be more progressive, and the reasons why it lost. And that debate playing out now could shape who runs in 2 years, or who throws their names into the hat to run. That debate that's happening now in the party could shape the primary in 2 years.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for the work you do, and I love reading you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
This view will be an autopsy on why the Democrats lost so pervasively, not only in Pennsylvania, but the rest of the country. Having already given my perspective in last week's show, this view will be a compilation harnessing a cross-section of editorial writers across the ideological spectrum. I am pleased to remind you that I had predicted the red wave in a view a week before the election, when I predicted the Democrats would be buried under an avalanche of votes. In today's view, I will address the rise and fall of the National Democratic Party. Somewhere in the coming winter of their discontent, meaning after November 5th, buried under an avalanche of votes and ice and snow, lies the seeds, hopefully, that in the spring come back to life again, because we need a strong two-party system in this country. No need for a victory lap now, but I think I have your attention. So I have scoured the intellectual landscape for some other perspectives to explain why it happened, and maybe a road out of the darkness for the Democrats. First is an editorial from moderate left New York Times columnist David Brooks, who I've quoted from before, by the way, in past views. And the title of his editorial is, quote, "Voters to Elites, Do You See Me Now?" Begin quote. We have entered a new political era. For the past 40 years or so, we lived in the information age. Those of us in the educated class decided that the post-industrial economy would be built by people like ourselves. Unfortunately, society worked as a vast segregation system, elevating the academically gifted above everybody else. That great sucking sound you heard was the redistribution of respect. People who climbed the academic ladder were feted with accolades, while those who didn't were rendered invisible. The chasms led to a loss of faith, a loss of trust, a sense of betrayal between the progressive elites and the working class. As the left veered toward identitarian performance art, Donald Trump jumped into the class war with both feet. His Queens-born resentment of Manhattan elites dovetailed magically with the class animosity being felt by rural people across the country. Trump's message was simple. These elites have betrayed you, and they are morons to boot. In 2024, he built the very thing the Democratic Party once tried to build, a multiracial working class majority. There will be some on the left who will say Trump won because of the inherent racism, sexism, and authoritarianism of the American people. Apparently, Democratic elites love losing and want to do it again and again and again. End quote. Next, one of my favorite conservative columnists, Bret Stephens, also of the New York Times, who weighed in with his own take in an editorial entitled, "A Party of Pontificators suffers humiliating defeat. Begin quote. How indeed did the Democrats lose so badly? The theory that many Democrats will be tempted to adopt is that a nation prone to racism, sexism, xenophobia, and rank stupidity fell prey to the type of demagoguery that once beguiled Germany. The broad inability of Democratic elites to understand Trump's political appeal, except in terms of flattering to their beliefs, is itself part of the explanation. Question: why did Harris lose? There were many tactical missteps. There was also a larger error of anointing Harris without political competition, an insult to the democratic process. But these mistakes of calculation lived within the three larger mistakes of worldview. First, the conviction among many Democratic elites that things were pretty much fine, if not downright great, in Biden's America, and that anyone who didn't think that way was either a right-wing misinformer or a dupe. Second, the refusal to see how profoundly distasteful too much of modern progressivism has become to so much of America. Third, the insistence that the only appropriate form of politics when it comes to Trump is the politics of resistance, capital R. Now, regarding the first, I've lost track of the number of times pundits have attempted to explain why Americans should stop freaking out over sharply higher prices of consumer goods or the rising financing costs of their homes and cars, or insisting there was no migration crisis at the southern border, or averring that Biden was as sharp as a tack. Yet, when Americans saw and experienced things otherwise, the characteristic Democratic elite's response was to treat the complaints not only as baseless, but also as immoral. The effect was to insult voters while leaving Democrats blind to the legitimacy of the issues. Second, the dismissiveness with which Democratic elites treated those concerns was part of something else. Dismissiveness toward the moral objections many Americans have to various progressive causes. Question: concerned about gender transitions for children or about biological males playing in girls' sports teams? You're a transphobe. Dismayed by tedious DEI seminars that treat white skin as inherently problematic? You're a racist. Irritated by new terminology that is supposed to be more inclusive, but feels that if it is borrowed from a page from George Orwell's 1984? The politics of today's left is heavy on social engineering according to group identity. It also increasingly stands for the forcible imposition of the bizarre cultural norms. And finally, last, the Democratic elites thought that the best way to stop Trump was not to treat him as a normal, if obnoxious, political figure with bad policy ideas, but instead as a mortal threat to democracy itself. This style of opposition led Democrats astray. It goaded them into their own form of anti-democratic policies. Today, the Democrats have become the party of priggishness, pontification, and pomposity. It makes them feel righteous, but how is that ever going to be a winning electoral look? End quote. Well, there you have it, a way out of the darkness. The bad news for Democrats so far is that the hysteria and denial and anger are still clouding their judgment. They are still blaming Americans for their vote instead of looking in the mirror, which means the losing will continue unless they change.